Hi, welcome back to St. Thomas Aquinas for everyone. My name is Dave Palmer, and thank you so much for journeying through the Summa with me. We are in question number 2, part 1, article 3, and this is the famous question in the Summa talking about the existence of God, and we showed how it can be demonstrated that God exists, and Thomas asked in the first article about whether God's existence is self-evident, and he said not really, but kind of qualified that. First question was about sacred doctrine, where God reveals things to us through the church that help us reach our final end that we would not come to know naturally through the light of our natural reason, right? And so just as a reminder that the whole Summa is about us achieving our ultimate happiness, our beatitude, which is perfect knowledge of God. And of course, to know God is to love God, and that will be our state in heaven. But we can have glimpses of it, some participation in that happiness here on earth. And we'll get into all that as we journey our way through the Summa. So even though we're only in question number 2, we've covered a lot of ground so far, and there is a whole lot more, 629 more questions of the Summa before it's all over. So let's move on to the next proof for the existence of God. We've already covered the proof through motion and also the proof through cause, and those two were very, very, very similar. And now this next one is called possibility and necessity, and it has to do with God's creation and then God himself. And so this is just kind of a basic picture of creation. Obviously, it's just an artistic rendering of creation, but it shows you that when God decided to create the world and all the creatures, there was a whole variety of creatures, but they are just that. They're creatures and they're not the creator. And so what Thomas is going to say here is that we observe, and remember, these 5 proofs all have to do not with what Scripture says or what divine revelation says. These are all things that we can come to know through the light of our natural reason and through our senses, through which we come to learn everything that we know. So Thomas says, we observe that some things are possible to be and not to be, right? So what is an example of something that could be, but then again, could not be? It's pretty much everything in creation, right? Like like a grizzly bear, right? Could you imagine that this grizzly bear, that perhaps you've seen one at the zoo or maybe out in the wild or something, it exists, but if it didn't exist, well, life would go on, right? It's not necessary, absolutely. The existence of that grizzly bear or any grizzly bear is a possibility, but not a necessity for the world to continue, right? Here's another one, kind of a silly example, but an ice cream sundae, even a 4-scoop, not a sundae, but a cone, a 4-scoop ice cream cone, right? Obviously, it exists, but if it didn't exist, life would go on, and we wouldn't have as many calories from it either. All right, what about this? You and I, human beings, okay? Obviously, we know that it's great that we exist. It's great that we came into the world. We're enjoying our lives, hopefully. But if you or I or anybody else that we know didn't exist, well, the world would keep on going. So that means that by definition, we are not necessary, right? So if everything like the skunk, right? And we know that skunks are not necessary, but they're an important creature and they're interesting and all that, but they're not necessary. They're just they exist, but they could be corrupted and die, and that's okay. Life goes on, right? And even something like an inanimate rock, obviously the world could go on without the existence of a rock, but they play their part in the overall scheme of things, right? So basically, all this shows is that everything that is created could not exist, and everything would be pretty much fine, right? And then Thomas says, if all things could possibly not exist, then at some point nothing would have existed and nothing would have begun to exist. Do you follow that? If everything is just contingent or possible and it came into being and then it goes out of existence, well then logically you would say, well then at some point nothing existed, because none of these things like the skunk or the ice cream cone or the grizzly bear are absolutely necessary, right? So then Thomas goes on to say, okay, if all these things do exist, but they're existence is not necessary and at some point they won't exist, then, well, okay, at some point nothing existed. But we do know that something came into existence, so now we're going back to kind of the uncaused cause, but from a different angle. Something had to have gotten things into motion, the proof for motion, and something had to have been the first cause, and it had to be an uncaused cause. And so in this proof, Thomas is saying there must be something, the existence of which is necessary, because otherwise, if this necessary thing doesn't exist, then none of these contingent or possible things would have existed in the first place. And as you can probably guess, Thomas is going to say that this necessary being is God. Okay, so does that make sense? Of the three that we've studied so far, which of them are the most convincing for you? I actually like a lot the next two that we're going to cover, the proof from perfection and also the proof from intelligence or governance of the world. That's actually my favorite one, as I mentioned before. So here's a reminder again, this beautiful picture of creation, all these wonderful things that God has created that are not necessary, but there had to be something necessary in order for all these to exist. And there are some wonderful questions and articles that Thomas is going to ask later on in the Summa about, for example, why is there such a variety of creatures? Why don't we just have 100 species of animals? Why do we have millions and millions of all these different creatures? The answer to that is absolutely fascinating. So this is where we have been and where we are going. Tomorrow we'll look at the proof from perfection, and that is something that ties into your everyday life, because we're always looking and judging things according to some scale of perfection. But we'll get into that tomorrow. And then 2 days from now, we'll do intelligence. And then we will be moving on from question number 2 in the Summa. So anyways, I thank you for watching this one. And please comment below and let me know how you're handling this. Do these all make sense? Maybe you've never thought of these. Maybe you've studied these before and you might have a different approach or a different way that they can be explained. Just start a conversation and let's converse. Let's talk about this stuff, because nothing to me is more interesting than Thomistic philosophy, and I appreciate that you are journeying through the Summa with me. All right, that's going to do it for today. I'll see you tomorrow. This has been St. Thomas Aquinas for everyone as we are moving through the Summa Theologia by St. Thomas Aquinas. God bless you.